Welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast. I'm Dr. Kyra Kendrick. My leadership philosophy is rooted in purpose, connection, and intentionality. I believe that we were all placed on this earth for a specific purpose, and part of being a good leader means figuring out what that purpose is and then executing it in a way that is beneficial to others. Another part of my philosophy of being a great leader is through connection. I don't think that we can walk through this world alone, and the importance of having connection and community are something that not only shouldn't be taken for granted, but are also something that other leaders need in order to be successful. The last part of my philosophy is intentionality. It's great that we have purpose and we have connection, but we must be intentional. We must show up to certain spaces as ourselves, and we must make sure that we are being intentional in our conversations and in our actions before, during, and after we leave a space. The Dr. Charles Whitcomb Leadership Institute helped me hone these skills. I love my cohort and the 3 years that we spent together, and all it did was teach me that showing up authentically and being vulnerable can only help you be successful as a leader. I hope that you enjoy the episode.
Greetings and welcome to the One Question Leadership Podcast, where we highlight executive leadership in college athletics. I am joined by Randale Richmond. Randale is the Vice President and Director of Athletics at Kent State. And Dr. Ron Moses. Dr. Ron Moses is the Executive Senior Associate for Internal Operations and Student Athlete Welfare at Old Dominion. Greetings, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, pleasure being with you again, Ty.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Good to be a newbie on the podcast.
Right. No problem. Now, Ron, I was racking my brain every time I see you in the last couple of years trying to figure out where I know you from or where I first met you. And it wasn't until recently talking to you that you started off in football.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, I spent almost 15 years at the American Football Coaches Association. So I think you came across when you started off, and I was always trying to meet all the young guys everywhere because how can I plug you in and get you to meet other people? So I wonder about that football, and now you're high up in administration at ODU. Tell me about the transition out of football. And I don't think you coached, but getting out of football sometimes is hard for people to do. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I was a football junkie. Like even playing, I was always on the Rivals sites and looking at rankings and looking at, who was getting what since I was younger and then wanting to be ranked, wanting to be on that stuff. So my goal was kind of even if I didn't coach, was a scout, player personnel, ops, things of that nature. So when I finished college, I was supposed to go back full-time military. I worked some deal out where I had to do, instead of 4 years active, 6 years reserves. And I could go pursue, whatever it was that I wanted to do. So now, okay, I need to get a GA ship. So that's how I ran across AFCA. Some folks at Georgia told me about it, went to AFCA and met Sherrod Everett, actually, who's at Southern Miss now, when he was at Western Kentucky. And really kind of just went, met some coaches, went home, emailed them, and really just blindly drove to some of these different places. Met them at Western Kentucky, ended up getting in the program, getting a GA ship, and I worked in ops recruiting for a couple years. And then the transition out was Coach Tiger got a job at South Florida, and that's when I really learned the game, right? So we're on a recruiting visit. Coach Tiger's not there. We don't know where he's at. Official visits. We don't know where he's at. He's interviewing. He gets the job. I naively think, oh, everybody's going. We all going, right? Like, that's what happens. And I quickly learned a new game. And it's funny, the convention, AFCA that year was in Nashville. And Western Kentucky from Nashville is an hour, right? It's real close. So they're like, yeah, we get our resumes ready, everything for AFCA. I'm like, we not all going because we hadn't heard anything.
Yeah.
Then you hear one by one, you hear coaches, start going. Raymond Woody, who's a coach now head coach at Bethune-Cookman, some of the different coaches, they start going, right? And a few of us, didn't go. We got left. You know what I mean? So my boy Jamarcus Shepard, who's the co-OC at Alabama, he got left with me. We was GAs together. And some of us got left. And I'm like, oh, okay. So what happens now? So my transition out was I was the academic liaison for them because my undergrad degree was in education. And Sherrod called me and said, hey, I know a guy named Clint Dowdle.
Yeah.
And he was in the MAC with me. He was the chief of staff at K-State. Now he's a super agent. And there's a football academic job at K-State. I know him. I know Albert Bimper. We know some of those things. And that's how I transitioned out into something else, because I was like, okay, how can I get something a little more stable than football, but still making an impact? And so, like, when I heard football academic counselor, I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That kind of is the intersectionality of everything that I like, which is academics and athletics. And so once I got into that field, I've kind of just stayed and had an upward trajectory in that area ever since.
Oh, yeah, no, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And there's a point, Randale, I believe, when you were at, I first came across you when you did a interview. I was doing a book review.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
With athletic director, with Terry Toomey.
Yes, sir.
When you were at ODU at the time. And so what I learned here talking to you, now that we're here together on this Charlotte AFCA trip, is that you hired Ron.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Yeah, hired Ron at ODU. So Ron and I had an interaction early on in my career when I was at Kent State, because his cousin was a running back / cornerback at Kent State. And, there's some things that were going around his transcripts of Ron being who he is. I definitely understand now, had drove up to make sure his cousin Demetrius Monday was doing all right. And
he just showed up like, hey, my cousin here.
He had a bad semester, and his dad drove from Atlanta, and to get to Ohio, you got to go to Kentucky.
Yeah.
Now, I wasn't exactly on the route, so he went out his way, picked me up, and we went to Kent to make sure, and he ended up graduating. We got it all. We got it all together. And that was his freshman year, too.
Yeah.
So that was his freshman year. He had a bad semester. He was redshirting. And then after that, I don't think he had a slip up.
Not at all. And he's a very charismatic young man, too, so it's beautiful to see him figure it out. But at the time, there's this academic advisor named Kyra Kendrick.
Okay.
And, Ron and all of them had a good relationship together. So here I get to Old Dominion University, and we're looking to, they just went from FCS to FBS, fall of 2014. I get there spring of 2015. And, athletic director Wood Seelig there gives me an opportunity to revamp and reimagine everything structurally within their academics, compliance, and student athlete services units. And I, see a way that I can take them from an FCS operation to an FBS operation. So on that first round of interviews, I'm calling all the up-and-comers I know in the industry and establish I'm going to give you an opportunity to oversee an entire unit, especially people who work specifically in football, because Old Dominion had this desire to move forward in football. They just had already done it from going from the CAA over to Conference USA, and we wanted to keep that trajectory going. So Ron interviewed on the first time. Now, he was probably the younger, least experienced out of all the people I did interview.
Yeah.
And I ended up hiring a young lady named Reagan Hill. But from that day forward, I said, when this comes back around, no matter where I am, I got to go find Ron Moses.
Okay.
So lo and behold, Reagan, she leveled up, got a great opportunity right down here in Charlotte to work with Mike Hill. And I remember going to our deputy AD at the time at ODU, Ken Brown. I'm like, hey, I got a guy.
You know what I mean? Already got somebody lined up.
I'm already ready to go. And by that time, Ron's name had began to ring more and more and more. So I knew I needed to jump on that, because he was a perfect transition from us building it, Reagan and I, to having somebody came in to cultivate it and take it to a new level.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Ron did. I mean, we had a blast doing it.
No, that's excellent. What's interesting about your story, Ron, as I'm learning, is that you didn't finish high school, right?
No.
Now we're Dr. Ron Moses.
Right.
Right. Tell me about that transition. And did you play football?
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about those things, because there's a transition out of playing that I want to talk to you about later in the conversation.
Yeah. So it was what was interesting is, played baseball, football my whole life. My dad passed when I was middle school, so it's like 12, right? And so my dad was my coach. He kind of handled everything. Not that my mom wasn't involved, but he handled everything. So I actually was he had everything lined up. I was supposed to go to this high school called Marist, which is where Sean McVay went. So I would have been on the same team as Sean McVay. Wow. Really nice private school, whatever. Like, he had everything lined up. He passed. I'm telling my mom, like, yeah, we got all this stuff. She's like, I don't know what you're talking about. You going to the local school, which my local school actually was a powerhouse. But it also was a rough school, right? So ended up going, she working now, one parent household, things of that nature. So at a certain point, probably 10th grade, I just stopped going to school, right?
Really?
We had other stuff going on. There was other ways you can make money. There was other things that you can do. So I ended up learning eventually. Probably I stopped going to school for some months. My mom lived her. She worked in the hospital. So 7P, 7A, 7A, 7P, 7 to 7 ain't gone. So by the time she's gone, and she worked about an hour away or 45 minutes away, you don't know if I went to school or not. By the time you back home, I'm already home. And so that's when I learned about the wonderful truant officer, people. And if you miss enough, right, they come look for you. And then if they come look for you, they also take you, right? So at a certain point, you had missed enough, and then, they start doing different things. So there was a National Guard ran program. So by that point, I had fully dropped out. And there was a National Guard ran program called Youth Challenge Academy that pretty much every state has. The one in Virginia is actually in Virginia Beach. Every state has it, and it's for ward of the state, juvenile delinquent, whatever reform, down in Hinesville, Georgia, and Fort Stewart. And so I finished high school there, or whatever high school. So we got our GED, things of that nature. So that's when I kind of went into a very structured environment, right, where I go from unstructured, not a lot of help, not a lot of men around, no positive influences, to now I'm in a dorm with 50 other dudes, right, with a bunch of men, right, and structure and things of that nature. And that was just the area where I really flourished, right, in that structure, because I was never somebody was looking to do it. It was just kind of like, all right, what are we doing here, right? We don't have any direction. And that place really gave us the ultimate amount of direction, right? What do you want to do? We went to class every day. You worked out. You got to join a club, an organization. You had to do an activity. So when you're from a certain background and you start to realize, like, man, it's more to life than going to the skating rink and going to the high school football game and battle the bands and other things outside of that. That's kind of when everything kind of opened up for me. And they allowed us to take a couple college classes if we tested into it. And I didn't test into it. And I remember being so mad, right? And so that's the first place where I was like academically challenged to be like, okay, well, if I'm gonna be here, be excellent, right? I say that all the time. So if we're gonna do this, let's like really do it. And then it kind of took off from there.
Oh yeah, no, that's excellent. And then did you play in college?
So at Georgia Military College. So I went to Georgia Military College, went to the military first. So I joined the military at 17, did that for a little while, then went back to become an officer. So I went to Georgia Military College, which is a military junior college in Milledgeville, Georgia. Burt Williams, who passed a couple years ago.
I made him the JUCO community chair.
Yep. How about that? He passed a couple years ago, and we had some good coaches. Coach Lunsford, who got Georgia Southern, Coach Cabral, like a bunch of coaches. They've done a lot of good stuff. But went to GMC, had a good history. Really went there for military, honestly, and then was kind of like, oh, they got a football team. And then like, you can go if you want to participate. It was just like an open thing. So was able to kind of get my love back for sports when I went there. And then ultimately ended up getting hurt while I was at Georgia Military College. And then I remember while I was hurt, I had to go up in that tower and film. And we had one of those big rappel military towers where we filmed from, and it was swaying, and it was, it was kind of going back and forth. So that kind of piqued my interest into, okay, what is the world of, sports look like if this is something that I want to do.
What year was that?
That was 2008. No, yeah, I graduated 2008. That's what year that was.
That was before that Notre Dame accident with the tower?
It was before. Okay. It was before the Notre Dame accident. It was before.
Because it was after, you probably wouldn't have been up
it was not after. It was before. So it was like, yeah, I want to do something like this. I don't want to do that, right? But I want to do something like this. And then spoke to Coach Williams about it. Coach Williams went to Georgia. We had a couple players going to Georgia. My roommate, who passed last year, Akeem Hebron, was going to Georgia to play. He actually they had a thing where when you get kicked out, you go to GMC and you come back. So he was going back. So I actually ended up going up there to just go, maybe see if I could walk on, do ROTC, get an education, work. And then I thought that was going to be it. And I was going to go back to the military because I was already on contract. So I thought, okay, go to Georgia, go enjoy some football games, commission, and go back about your career and have a 20-year career. But it didn't work like that. So,
Right. Okay. Yeah. So one thing I wonder, student athlete welfare, right? And we probably can all either have dealt with it or know people who dealt with it. And it's this thing about your identity as an athlete, right? And separation of who I am versus what I do. Yeah. And as athletes, it's very hard to separate that if you haven't started well before you retire from playing.
Correct.
Right? And if you haven't started, once you retire from playing, now you have an identity crisis. For me specifically, what helped me not have to deal with that was when I was at Michigan State as a walk-on, at some point I realized that everybody was a better athlete than me.
Right.
So now it was just fun. Like, okay, I ain't making it beyond this scout team, so this is just fun to me. So when it's over, right? And that helped me when I graduated. We're trying to figure out things. But I know people who, they finish playing, they disappeared, they don't talk to the homies for a couple of years because they're trying to figure it out, or they're working at a factory, miserable or something like that. And then they realize, oh, I'm actually a real person. I can go back to school kind of situation. So military specifically, right? Because they deal with that too.
Yeah,
I know
time.
some military guys who are like hard to deal with civilians, and how come everybody's not organized and overachieving at the same
Very
time?
much so, yeah.
So I wonder about both of you from your perspective, you being over student athlete welfare and being a veteran, and then you being an athletic director, trying to make sure that as the kids graduate from all sports, that they're, before they graduate, you're focusing on this identity of who you are, so that when you finish playing, you're not stuck in this crisis. Either one of you guys want to?
Yeah, I'll start out. The reason I'll start out is because Ron was a big piece in my vision for just that.
Okay.
Because what he was going to bring after the infrastructure was built was credibility of story.
Okay.
Because how many people do you know who haven't graduated high school and they then now leveled up to a way that you can't even imagine? So, I felt as if Ron's words, once we created this program of student athlete development, and I give a shout out to the Lamar Pottinger. He created the most amazing student athlete development group and at ODU at the time. But I needed the person who, when they don't have access to me, they can engage with a person who cares about them beyond just what they do on the playing surface. Right. So that's what Ron was. So that was always in my philosophy. And as you talked about my value system, right? My value system is even at Kent State, it used to be graduate student athletes and win championships. So when I got the AD job, we changed it because we went through a strategic plan in that first summer. Graduate student athletes boldly prepared for life after sport and win championships. That's right there in the middle, because that's the core importance of it. And they're not going to just take all this in and say, oh, I get it now, Mr. Richmond. But what you're doing is you're trying to build habits and give them access to things so they see that they are more than just whatever they do out there on the playing surface. And anytime I meet with recruits, I would tell them, who's your favorite player? And sometimes I would bring up different players. And I say, Kobe Bryant is one of the people who was most prepared to be boldly prepared for life after sport. This guy gave every ounce of everything he had of him to the game of basketball. And immediately when it was over, he transitioned like that, because he understood that there was something on the other side. And then I tell him, I'm not here to be a dream killer. Whether it's 2 months, 2 years, or 20 years like Tom Brady and LeBron James, at some point in time, you have to be ready to transition to life after sport. We at Kent State want you boldly prepared for that. No fear, confident beyond measure, to the point where when we did Alston, you would get the first half of your Alston for just being academically eligible, in good standing, etc. But you wouldn't get your second half of Alston, an extra $3,000, unless you went through our student athlete development program throughout the year. And we wouldn't give you that second half immediately. We would defer it to graduation. So you would have some money right there to help you transition. Yeah. Maybe you want to take a step away. Maybe you want to have a down payment for grad school. Maybe you get that first time job and all of a sudden you're on a different coast. Well, you ain't getting travel expenses for that first job. You know what I mean? Boldly prepare for life after sports. So it became a core. It's always been a core thing for me. Ron became an agent of that because he was tangibly a person who they can touch a story and attach a story to see, wow, this is more important, because I wouldn't have been lost if I hadn't found education. So that's how I've always looked at it.
And then so what is the program? Because I know you're a big core values person, right? One thing we relate on. What is the program to help the student athletes understand who they are while they are actually in school?
Our student athlete development program.
Okay.
So it really is a lot of what I learned from Lamar. And I still, each time we get a person who runs our student athlete development, I have them get a hold of Lamar. I said, I want you to copy as much as you can and bring that system from the NCAA. And Dee Mary does a great job too. Bring that system to Kent State's campus. You know what I mean? And we'll send them to the NCAA programming to get them to do it, because they talk about different things. Growth mindset. They do the DISC assessment and other assessments of personality, see who you are as a human being, that holistic you. And then now the language is in, now they start to share that nomenclature. Now that conversation is there. And then we engage them in that manner. So it starts with the programming, because you learn about yourself in year one. Then in year two, you learn about yourself and how you can then lead your teammates. And then in year three, the program will have them teach these things to year ones and year twos. Because now it's gotten into you because you can now teach it. So that's that holistic self. You're more than just this athletic identity.
Yeah. One last question on that line of thinking. Now you have the potential to have people who are only there for a year.
Yeah.
And you want to pour all that and execute that purpose of boldly preparing in a 1 year stint. So tell me about that.
That's hard.
You're probably still trying to figure that one out. Right?
We are you got to go where their mind is. So we talk about money. All right. So if it's going to be NIL and it's going to be your brand, let's talk about brand identity.
Right.
All right. If you're out here doing all these things and this is what your social media looks like, do you think your brand is something that a Fortune 500 company is going to want to put all their equity behind? If the answer is no, then there's other parts of you that are important. Tangible example, we had this young man named Chris Payton, and he was only with us for a year. And this kid could jump out the gym. He's one of them ones. But when we had him out there, we thought, okay, maybe he'll get a deal with Dunkin' Donuts or all these things locally. The feedback we got was like, Chris, we don't know your personality enough.
Oh, wow.
We don't see the real you enough. We see all the dunks. That's exciting. But people attach to who you are humanistically. So what do you like? He had a wide range of music. The young man from Sade all the way to Master P, all the way to Lil Durk. Like the young man was a very eclectic young man. I said, see, that's the other sides of you that are fully developed. That's actually more interesting than the basketball you.
Okay, so getting them to see that part of it.
That was the transactional way that we could help Chris see it. So hopefully that seed is planted. And as he's there overseas right now over time, he remembers that part of it.
I love that. You're taking the transactional life that they're living now and figuring out a way to make that transformational by understanding, hey, they're actually buying into you, so let's figure out who you are.
That's right.
And then that'll click when he finishes playing that he has actually been transacting on who he is and not necessarily the basketball aspect.
That's the hope.
No, I love it. That's the hope, right? That's the hope. ODU, right? And I guess you do some other stuff too on the side in terms of transition and identity and who you are and how you can succeed. Talk to me about your philosophy on that and some of the things you either do there at ODU or you do in your own life outside of college athletics.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is in the military, I had a lot of friends who really struggled, still struggling with transition. I think I was unique because I went active, so I saw what it looks like. Then I went to college, was like, whoa, this is different. Then I went back, came out. Most officers go to college first, then they go to their military career, so they kind of already are set, like this is what I wanted to do. Most enlisted may go to college wherever community they're in, right? So if you in the Navy and you in Norfolk, you go to ODU, right? But that's not a college experience for you. You just taking night classes. So I think for me, my transition was a lot easier than them because I lived one life, thought I wanted to do one thing, then was able to go to college, then was able to kind of switch that trajectory versus already having it set. So we do is at the Hampton VA, started doing one Thursday a month, we do a lot of military transition classes once they ETS. We saw a large number of what we call recidivism, not in the criminal sense, but in the military sense of they coming right back.
Yeah.
Right. And it costs a lot when somebody, Tai transitions out, Tai wants to come right back within 8 months to a year. You don't want to put vets out there in the real world. And what it is, sure, when we take them back, great. But at certain points, no war, no need, the person couldn't come back. So now that person couldn't come back. We have mental health, we have all kind of disorders. So what it was how do we prepare these people who saying like, I want to ETS? Do you know where you're going? Do you have a job? Do you have a resume? Your job, like my job was unit supply, logistics, armor. That was a little bit easier to translate. But if you're an armor fuel specialist, what does that mean? How can I change this into this? Oh, well, this sounds like you might be a project manager. This sounds like you could work in a water treatment plant. This sounds like in these areas. And so we really try to figure out where you going, who are you as a person, as a core person once you leave here? Do you need to be near like-minded individuals? So should you stay? A lot of people get out the military and stay in the area that they finished, just like athletes do. Should you stay in this area? Should you go home? Do you have community? Do you have a job? And we just kind of work through those things. So we end up bringing that to athletes because they kind of go through the same exact thing. And where I experienced that was at the University of Georgia when I'm sitting there, I'm working with the team, I'm helping out, and it's Fred Gibson. I'm like, it's Fred Gibson. This is Odell Thurman. This is Quincy Carter. This is all these dudes. But what I realized is these were NFL stars, but now they were back, right? They were back to earn their degree. But the biggest thing was like, what I got a general sense was like, they didn't know what to do next. That's why they were there, right? So I'm sitting here looking at Fred Gibson, Cincinnati Bank. I mean, this is a bona fide receiver. And I'm like, I'm hanging out with Fred Gibson. But again, I didn't realize the situation of like, he was really trying to figure out, do I want to coach? What is it I'm doing next with my life? So really wanting
you probably realized that you were further along in person
in an identity
than they were. You know what I mean?
Way further along. And then unfortunately, and people can look this up, there's something at Georgia called the Paul Oliver Network that Coach Rick started because Paul Oliver, who was a fourth round draft pick of the Chargers, he played in the NFL for a few years, retired, actually was doing well. was a manager at Verizon, and then he committed suicide, right? Because the transition he had a wife, he had kids, he had a good job, but it just wasn't there. So Coach Rick actually started a program specifically for the football alums, people, things of that nature. So what I used to do every year, one of my guys, Reggie Carter, who runs the NIL now at Georgia, like I would hire him as a GA at Mizzou when I was at Mizzou.
Yeah.
So I would always hire a former Georgia football guy or just somebody from the network as a grad assistant where I was, or connect them to other people as grad assistants and things of that nature. So I was just trying to figure out what is our part in helping them transition, because for so long the recruiting process is from them being 14, 15, 16, come here, you're going to be great, you're going to be great, you're going to be great. Then you get there, it's not working out. And now, not a single coach sometime talks to you about, okay, well, this is what happens next. Or the NFL, they're not recruiting you in the NFL. Like, you go into the combine, you're trying to sell yourself.
Yeah.
So how do I sell myself? And then obviously that post-graduation career. And the last thing I'll be doing that, Coach Rick used to say something that every new class came in, I remember this, and the first day, like, there's 25, there's 30 of y'all. And y'all have come to one of the top schools in the country at producing NFL talent. He said, in every class, a top NFL draft is, if we get 6 to 10 people in the draft, that's a great year for any school, Alabama, Georgia, anything. And there's 25 of y'all here, and I'm telling you that 6 to 10 of y'all is going to make it. So you're like, the other 20, you got to go to work, right? And so he's like, and you're at the best school that does this, one of the best schools that does it. So he used to always I'm like, okay, I see what he's saying. So regardless if you have a 10-person draft class, the majority of that class is not going pro.
Yeah.
The majority of it. So transitioning is important. And to your point, I would see guys really struggle with that transition. They're in Atlanta working out for 5 years, waiting to get picked up. If you don't get picked up within that first year, it's not happening, right? But they would do it forever. And just seeing them really struggle with that transition, with that identity, even as I go back home, I still see some people that really struggle. So we try to help them into whatever their next identity and career is, whether that's coaching or whether that's I work here or I went back to school. You know, a man has to have something that he feels like, you know, I'm Randale Richmond, I play here. Now I'm Randale Richmond and I do X. And those are the things that we try to teach.
And you have specific programs at ODU?
Yeah, so we have specific programs. So to piggyback on what you talked about with the 1 year stuff, we've completely revamped our program because I don't get people for 4 years anymore, right? So because of my background in academia and teaching, I've created a curriculum of classes. So now a person can come in and they take it right away when they come. I got 3-hour courses, because where else, 3 hour, like 3 credit hour, where else am I going to have time to teach this person all this stuff? So we have a transition course in the summer. We do an NIL financial literacy course in the fall. And then we have a sports social justice, which still teaches those elements of diversity in sport, things of that nature, responsibility, some of those things. So most of our students, depending on credit hours and transfers and all that, they should have taken at least one or all 3 of those courses when they're coming through. And we typically do it for some of the more at-risk sports, right? If they come in. And so we still do our program, our regular programming. We ask our students to do 5 hours of community service and 2 programs a semester. The community service is because when we talk about maximizing NIL, you'll get more NIL. People know who you are in the community. So if you're a starting quarterback, you most likely going to have a foundation. You need to start getting that in your head. No different than Lamar Jackson. You need to have a foundation. You need to have some sort of thing that you really attach to, because that endears you to a certain part of the community, a certain subset, which helps sell tickets, which helps sell jerseys. And so we do that every semester in addition to our classes.
That's excellent. I wonder, I mean, you're both probably in the mix, having to convince donors how to split their dollar to support athletics, the NIL or whatever version of that it is now in the history department, right, in academics. I wonder about those conversations and how, like, is there a ROI for donors in that? If you're giving money specifically to a collective or hybrid structured, and that goes directly to student athletes that may be there for a year, may or may not play good or not, and then gone, what is the ROI to a donor? I mean, a donor giving money to athletics is like supporting scholarships or supporting the building, or even like we talked offline before, a business giving money, they can see their signs up and impressions and however they measure all that stuff. But tell me about the ROI for donors in terms of this current way things operate of money to guys, money to kids. You know what I mean?
I try to break it down and try to use a little bit of history. and then try to bring in some current reality. What I mean by that tangibly is, okay, donors, one day, I tell them, hey, one day you started out and you said, hey, I'm not going to support scholarships. That's the university's job. Then you saw schools like Old Dominion, La Tech start being the first institutions to give women's basketball scholarships. So then you started to get the winning. And so then it became, well, I do want to be associated with winning.
Yeah.
Right. So then you had donors started giving to scholarships. Then you got to a point in time where everyone started giving scholarships and it became brick and mortar. And donors said, I'm not giving the brick and mortar, that's the university's job. And then institutions started giving the brick and mortar, they started getting the better student athletes, they started winning.
Yeah, okay.
So then donors started to give to brick and mortar. And then, more recently you said, and then they say, hey, we can give cost of attendance. And the donor said, I'm not paying student athletes, I'm not giving cost of attendance, so on and so on and so on. At some point in time, it becomes what it takes to recruit and retain the best talent in order to yield an outcome. So what I talk about more now is the honest reality of transactional engagements, but majority of ours will still be relational. You're going to have a foundation of relational. This is important for graduation. This is important for the access of and the retention of high level talent, and to get that talent to a degree position, and to get that talent to be boldly prepared for life after sport. This is what it's going to take. So look at it as the new scholarship. But majority of what we do is still going to have some very much foundational transformational engagement sprinkled in with some direct transactions. This kid's coming in for 1 year to be a supplement to our foundational folks to help us yield an outcome. Because when we yield that outcome, it's going to help our foundational folks get to that finish line of graduation and have an amazing life after sport. And your identity is going to be attached to something that you're already passionate about. I tell people, come from internal, I had a hard time thinking about if I become an AD, man, I don't know how I'm going to fundraise. I don't want to ask people for money. I shipped my thinking on that maybe about 10, 12 years ago. I'm not asking for your money. What I'm trying to do, if you have a passion, I'm trying to align your passion with our purpose. That's what I'm doing. Tell me about your passion. Tell me what you're interested in. Wow, we got a purpose within our athletics department for that. Let's see if that matches together. And then you sprinkle in those transactions. And the best ones we've seen thus far are the transactional things that are for retention or a position here or there supplement.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually right. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So, the biggest commonality between an athlete and a donor most likely is a lot of times that donor was an alum from that school or a school, typically. Biggest commonality between them is academics. That's number one. It's academics, right? You have to tell the story of, what are they majoring in? What are they going to do? Things of that nature. So what we really did was hyper-focused, obviously, on without a good academic performance, you can't really make the other ass that you want to. We don't have a single team now under a 3.0.
Yeah,
a single team, right? Every single one. Men's basketball, football are 3.1, 3.2 teams. Every team is there with top 10 in community service on helper annually. So what that does is it makes it a lot easier to go to your board of visitors, your president, your campus community, and say, hey, athletes are doing their part academically. We're graduating at a high level. We have high GPAs. We have diverse amount of majors. We're in the community. We want to front off a sports award for innovation. We're doing all these different things. And so for us, that was more of the alignment of like, we can't always control what's on the court of the field. We can't always control that. But what we can control is student athlete outcomes, right? And that's what really bonds the teams because they feel pride in that. The donors take pride in knowing like, oh, you did what? Oh, you had a 3-1? What are you studying? What are you looking at? And they end up wanting to give a little bit more. Do people still want to win? Absolutely. But we find it's a lot easier to make the ask when the academics piece, when the community service piece, because it shows that we're equal in what we're carrying, right? So we want to carry our water, we want to hold our water. We don't want to just say like we're here, we're taking advantage of scholarship, and we're not giving full effort, right? Most of your donors have already given to your scholarship fund.
Yeah, right.
That's the majority of them are. So if they're giving to your endowed scholarship fund and the person that they're connected with is doing very well academically, they are more adept to want to give there, right? And so that's one thing I learned from, the AD that we both worked for, Wood, and our CFO, Ken Brown, was it's a lot easier to ask for money when your house is in order, right?
Yeah,
and so that really helps out a lot.
What you're saying is interesting because I do want to know how you reconcile that with, the wide receiver that we're trying to get coaches saying, hey, I need this guy.
Right.
What can you, you know what I mean? How do you reconcile that with it, right? Because he might come in with the 3-point, he got to have the grades to get in.
Yeah.
But it's really about outcome on the field kind of situation.
Yeah, it's about outcomes. But those, it's so volatile right now. Those aren't consistent, right? Not really for anybody. So it's your outcomes, it's your player development, it's your engagement, things of that nature. You got to keep all that consistent, right?
Yeah.
You have to have a plan. You have to have a structured plan. And you can't just chase down ghosts all the time, right? So even with the playoffs, you're starting to see different philosophies, different things kind of coming and going and winning, right? I think about Notre Dame, right? Notre Dame's last coach left because he said he can't what? Academics are too high. They want too much. I can't win championships. New coach comes in and they are now in a national championship, right? With the same thing. The other coach on the other side, Ryan, that he can't win the big one. What do we do? It's constantly evolving, right? So even the teams of, LSU a couple years ago, Georgia winning 2 back-to-back, those coaches are having to constantly innovate. So with some of it, we remind our donors, like, nobody has the answers at all, right? Because one of the teams in the national championship, somebody left because they didn't think it was good enough to get to that level, and that person got that team to that level. So we have to constantly think about innovation and giving your donors a plan, right? That's what they like. They like a plan. Most of them are business people. Most of them are successful business people. So they want to know, what's the plan? How are we going to approach this? Do we need to change? And just being overly, because there's a level of communication and investment that's required to connect with them. So then ultimately, if you do a lot of that stuff correct, you can get the right players in to win, right? And not have to worry about, I need X amount of money to get this player, that this player wants to come because what we're developing. Or I can take what people will quote unquote call a less talented player, and with good player development, we can get them to that point. Kind of like the service academies, what they're doing now.
It's a piece in there that's a micro. That's what I mean by microtransactions, though. If the foundation of your group, that you use your funds to retain that foundation, and then now we got to sprinkle in a guy or two here. Now that might be a 2-5, 2-2 guy, you know what I mean. But our culture of our team and behaviors will not be overly influenced. Matter of fact, our behaviors will influence that person. If you never heard Damian Lillard's story about being at Weber State, that was what happened to him. The culture and the substance of the guys were like, no, we're going to study table. And no, we're going to be here, practice early. And he was the outlier. So he's like, well, I don't want to be the weirdo. Like, I need to go ahead and get like them. Right. So, but that can't be all of it. So the microtransactions still exist. And part of the reason I believe, well, we all know there's nothing more valuable in equity right now than retention. Even if you look at Ohio State's defense, because you brought that up, those are 4th and 5th year players. You don't see that anymore. And some of the other people subbing in are the microtransactions.
Correct.
So if you can look at it that way, if our foundation is strong enough, then we can go ahead and get some of these other microtransactions.
The core culture is there.
You got it. Yeah. That will give us
and that type of recruit, right? So Leonard Moore, you all probably heard of Dr. Moore, who runs Black Student Athlete Conference. Most people don't know his son. I was watching his son play for Notre Dame. He's a DB, was a really good 4-star talented defensive back. And he went to Notre Dame because he really liked Dr. Moore, who, like I said, runs Black Student Athlete Conference, knows everything about this stuff. I like the culture that they're bringing. He's recruiting certain type of players, right? He's making sure he maximizes his players. I think his son is a freshman. Very sure freshman is playing some, but they had Aeneas Williams' son. There's a lot of different people's, and then when they do take transfers, is Riley Leonard from Duke. When they do so, he was really steadfast with his culture, right? And if you look at talent-wise versus some of the teams they were playing, they might not have been as, quote-unquote talented, but he really put together a really good culture. To Randale's point, like, older teams win, right? So those Georgia teams that won back-to-back, those were old teams, right? Stetson Bennett was 25 years old, right? Those were really old teams. We see it in basketball. Those UConn teams were older. South Carolina women's basketball, those teams were older. They've been together a while. And if you look at the service academies, the reason why they're doing so well now is those guys have been together since probably prep or freshman year. And so as you do that, we haven't really seen a fully constructed portal team come in and just take the world by storm and win. You supplement, right? Or even Ohio State, Jeremiah Smith, their quarterback is one, but those D linemen, those O linemen, most of Ohio State's team and that core of that team has been there. That defense was reconstructed. But the defense guys on the reconstructed defense, other than Caleb Downs, they had been there. So you supplement with one or two, but overall your foundation has to be really good.
Microtransactions. I'll ask this last question, then we'll wrap. I'm gonna get to leadership here, right? So I'm gonna ask Randale, which I know he can do it. Sum up your organizational leadership philosophy in a brief 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah.
And then Ron, at some point you'll be running the shop somewhere, right? So I want you to be able to do that too. So Randale, what you got for us?
Student-centered, coach-led, administrator supported. And we need our student athletes graduate, administrators are in the background, coaches, you're in the front. Be worthy of that. You know, that's ultimately where it's at, because if you do that right, that's what leads towards retention and development of the talent and graduation of that talent. Student-centered, coach-led, administrator supported, and everybody has to be a star in each of their roles in that subset.
You do that right, that culture is developed, and then you also have donors that are willing to support the microtransactions.
Absolutely.
To help. 100%. I like that. Moses, you on the spot.
What I've learned is there's a certain level of communication investment that's required for the whole organization, top down, right? Good communication, good investment at certain levels helps the organization move forward, right? Organizational psychology is important. You have to look at your organization as a living, breathing mechanism, right? So making sure everybody's invested to a certain extent and make sure they can communicate to a certain extent is important. And that's all the way from your AD, your coaches, to your students. If all of that stuff is in order, and I put it down to those 2 simple ones, because you don't want to make it multifaceted, but communication and investment, if you have that at minimum, you're running in the right direction. You can just fine tune in other places.
Are those the first? Well, investment comes with time, but communication, is that some of the first things you implement if you come into a program?
First, anybody we hire is, hey, I need you to be invested into what you do at a certain level, and I need you to communicate and be fine. Students, same thing. Communication, investment, donors, everybody. That's kind of our thing, because our thing is championship effort. So we want championship effort in everything that we do. So when you break it down a little bit, how do I describe championship effort? How do I describe how you get to that standpoint? Communication is required on the field, off the field, everything we do to make sure the organization is moving forward, and a certain level of investment means you care, right? So when you say effort, it's investment. So we say communication, investment. Everybody we hire, those are the first 2 things that we put into our packet. New students come, things of that nature. That's important to us, because if you lose those 2 things, you pretty much on your 1 foot out the door, or you really don't want to be here. So if you have a high level in those areas, or at least a level in those 2 areas, you'll have a good employee, good student, good coach.
All the things that make a good culture. Well, gentlemen, this has been an excellent conversation. I really appreciate you joining us here on the One Question Leadership Podcast.
All right, appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes, sir. That was Randale Richmond. He's the Vice President, Director of Athletics at Kent State, and Dr. Ron Moses, who's the Executive Senior Associate Athletics Director for Internal Operations and Student Athlete Welfare at Old Dominion. And of course, I am Ty Brown with one question. And keep in mind, the role of a leader is to create and maintain an environment that people want to be a part of. And as always, be better tomorrow than you are today. This episode of the One Question Leadership Podcast is produced by Spades Media Group, solving problems using creative leadership.